The alarms had not even finished their first cry when my mother told me my life was over. I am Vexthara Knoll, third daughter of the Krillian matriarch, and on the day my people lost their third fleet in a single afternoon, I learned that I was to be given away like a gift wrapped in silence. Not sold, not traded for metal or land. Given, the way you give something you are afraid to keep. The humans had arrived among the stars only a few years before that day, and already every empire that once called itself powerful had learned to whisper their name carefully, as if saying it too loudly might draw their attention. We Krillians were bred for war. Our bodies are covered in plates of hardened chitin. Our bones are dense. Our claws can tear through steel if we are angry enough. We had fought 100 small wars among the stars and won most of them. We believed strength was a number. Count the ships, count the soldiers, count the years of training, and you would know who would win before the first shot was fired. Then the humans came, and the numbers stopped meaning anything. It began with a border dispute, nothing more. A scouting fleet of ours drifted too close to a human colony that we did not even know existed yet. Our commanders assumed the same rules applied that had always applied: overwhelm, intimidate, retreat if the enemy is stronger. It was a formula older than my grandmother. 3 of our battle fleets were gone within a single rotation of that system's star. Not damaged, not scattered, gone, as if they had never existed, and the strange part, the part that still makes my claws curl even now when I remember the reports, was that the humans had used almost nothing to do it. A handful of ships, fewer soldiers than we sent as an honor guard to a diplomatic dinner. My mother, the matriarch, does not fear easily. I have seen her stand unmoved, while a warlord twice her size threatened to remove her head from her shoulders. But when the reports came back from that battle, I watched her hands shake as she read them, and I understood, without being told, that something had changed in the galaxy forever. The Krillian Council met for 3 days without sleep. I was not permitted inside, but I stood close enough to the door to hear pieces of it. Words like annihilation, words like total collapse, and then, finally, a word I did not expect: peace. Humanity had not demanded our surrender. They had not glassed our home world, though every voice in that room agreed they could have. Instead, a quiet offer arrived through channels we did not know they had access to. A treaty, an old custom, borrowed strangely enough from our own traditions, one that even we had nearly forgotten. A marriage between houses, meant to bind 2 warring peoples together so tightly that breaking the peace would mean breaking a family. I did not know yet that the offer had come from the human side, not ours. I did not know that they were the ones who suggested it, gently, almost apologetically, as if they were embarrassed by what their soldiers had done and wanted a way to make sure it never had to happen again. I only knew that 3 days later, my mother called me into her chamber and could not look at me while she spoke. "You are the strongest choice," she said. "Not the strongest fighter, not the strongest speaker, but the one who can survive what is coming." I did not understand what she meant. I asked her if I was being given to a monster. She did not answer me. She only handed me a data slate with a single human face on it and told me the ship would leave within the week. His name was Ethan Miles. I studied that face for hours before I ever met him in person, searching it the way our scholars search old battle records, looking for the crack that would tell me where the weakness was. He did not look like a monster. He did not look like anything at all, really. Brown hair, tired eyes, an unremarkable jaw, the kind of face that could belong to 1,000 different humans, and none of them would stand out in a crowd. I remember feeling almost insulted. I had been raised on stories of towering conquerors and battle titans, and here was a man who looked like he might apologize if you stepped on his foot. I decided, sitting alone in my quarters with that slate glowing in my hands, that this would be easy. Whatever the humans had done to our fleets, whatever terrible weapon or strategy had erased 3 armies in an afternoon, it could not possibly be sitting inside this soft-eyed, ordinary-looking man they were giving to me as a husband. I told myself I would learn everything about him. I would find his fears, his limits, the places where he bent, and one day, when the time came, that knowledge would be worth more to my people than any weapon. I did not know yet how wrong I was about almost everything. The journey to the human outpost took 12 days. I spent most of it studying their language through translation implants, memorizing their customs from files that felt incomplete, edited, careful. I noticed that even in their own historical records, certain names appeared again and again beside gaps where information should have been. I told myself it was simply how a young species kept its secrets. I did not yet understand that some of those gaps were not secrets at all, but scars too raw for anyone to write down properly. When I stepped off the transport and onto human soil for the first time, my claws retracted instinctively, a habit bred into every Krillian since childhood, ready to defend, ready to strike if the air itself turned hostile. Instead, I found something almost disappointingly calm. Rows of humans in simple uniforms stood at attention along the landing platform, and among them, standing slightly apart, was the man from the slate. Ethan Miles did not look like a hero. He did not look like a conqueror. He looked, if anything, uncomfortable, as though he would rather have been anywhere else in the galaxy than standing there, being presented to an alien wife he had never asked for. He bowed his head to me instead of extending his hand, a gesture I later learned he had practiced, because he had read that Krillians consider open palms an act of aggression unless offered slowly. That small detail struck me more than anything else that day. Somewhere in the vast machinery of human military command, someone, perhaps this very man, had taken the time to learn how not to frighten me. "I am honored to meet you," he said, in careful, slightly clumsy Krillian. "I hope, in time, we can make something good out of this." I did not answer him kindly. I remember my exact words, cold and formal, because I had rehearsed them the entire journey. "I am here because my people require it. Do not mistake my presence for affection." He only nodded, as if he had expected exactly that, and said nothing more. He simply turned and led the way toward the quarters that had been prepared for us, walking slowly enough that I could keep pace, though my legs are shorter and less suited to human gravity than his. It was on that walk that I first noticed something strange. The soldiers we passed did not look at him the way soldiers look at an ordinary officer. They did not salute out of habit or duty. They stepped aside, quickly, almost as if his path through a hallway was something sacred, something not to be crossed carelessly. A young officer near the end of the corridor actually flinched when Ethan glanced toward him, flinched the way a small creature flinches from a predator many times its size, and then quickly composed himself and offered a stiff nod instead. I asked Ethan why the soldiers behaved that way around him. He only gave a tired half-smile and said, "They respect the uniform, not the man." I remember thinking, even then, before I understood anything, that this answer felt like a wall built quickly to hide something behind it. Over the following days, I studied him the way I had promised myself I would. I watched him eat, simply and without complaint, food that our own scholars would have called bland to the point of insult. I watched him work through long hours of reports and meetings, always polite, always careful with his words, never raising his voice even when frustrated. I watched him ask me questions about my home world with what seemed like genuine curiosity, not the practiced curiosity of a diplomat performing kindness, but something quieter and more real. He asked about the customs of my people, the songs we sang before battle, the way our claws could tell a story if you knew how to read the wear patterns on them. He listened in a way that made me forget, for small stretches of time, that I hated being there. I began to search for cracks in him, the way I had promised my mother I would, and I found strange, small ones instead of the ones I expected. He never spoke about his own service. Whenever another officer mentioned something called Kepler 9 in passing, his jaw would tighten, and the conversation would end within moments, redirected so smoothly that I almost missed it happening. Almost. One evening, a young soldier, clearly exhausted and not thinking carefully about his words, mentioned to another officer within earshot of us that the men still had nightmares about Kepler 9, and that some of them still could not sleep without the lights on. Ethan's entire posture changed in an instant. He did not shout. He did not even raise his voice. He simply said, "That is enough," in a tone so quiet and so absolute that the young soldier went pale and apologized 3 times before leaving the room entirely. I asked Ethan what Kepler 9 was. He told me it was an old battle, one that ended a difficult chapter of human history, and that he would rather not discuss it. I let the matter rest, not because I believed him, but because something in his eyes when he said it reminded me of my own mother's hands shaking over that first battle report. I recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had seen something too large to speak of casually. That night, unable to sleep, I accessed the Human Records archive using clearance I had been given as a courtesy, expecting to find nothing more than another gap in their history, another polite silence around an uncomfortable memory. Instead, I found his file. Most of it was blacked out, entire pages reduced to solid black rectangles where information should have been. But near the bottom, beneath a section that had somehow been left untouched, I found a number, a casualty count listed beside his name, connected to an engagement whose location had been redacted entirely. The number did not make sense. It was too large to belong to a single soldier's service record. It was the kind of number you would expect beside the name of an entire battalion, not one man standing quietly beside me at dinner every evening, asking politely about the songs my people sang before battle. I stared at that number for a long time that night, feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I told myself there had to be an explanation, a clerical error, a misprint, a number attached to the wrong name entirely. I did not yet know that in only a few days I would see with my own eyes exactly how that number came to exist, and that once I saw it, I would never again be able to look at Ethan Miles and see only an ordinary, soft-spoken man who apologized too much. The peace between our two peoples was still young, still fragile, still hated by those among my own kind who believed we had surrendered our pride the moment I stepped off that transport, and somewhere out among the stars, a group of my own people, furious at what they saw as a shameful bow to an alien conqueror, were already making plans to end that peace before it had a chance to take root. I did not know it yet, standing quietly in my quarters with a black redacted file glowing in front of me, but the quiet, apologetic man asleep in the next room was about to show me exactly why the entire galaxy had learned to fear a species that looked, on the surface, so disappointingly ordinary. The days that followed the discovery of that file passed strangely for me, because I began to live 2 lives at once. In one life, I was a wife learning to exist beside a quiet human man who cooked simple meals and asked gentle questions about my home. In the other life, I was a soldier's daughter trying to understand why that same man's service record contained a number that did not belong to any single person. I did not confront him immediately. I am not foolish. A weapon that large, whatever it truly was, deserved careful study before it was ever approached directly. So instead, I watched. Ethan Miles rose early every morning, before the artificial light of the outpost had even fully brightened the corridors. I would often find him already awake, standing at the narrow viewport in our quarters, looking out at the stars with an expression I could not quite name, not sadness exactly, something closer to a held breath, a permanent, quiet vigilance, as though some part of him never fully believed the peace around him was real. He would notice me watching and smile, a small, apologetic thing, and ask if I had slept well, and whether there was anything he could prepare for me that morning. It became a strange ritual between us. I would ask him small questions about human customs, testing him gently, watching how he answered, and he would ask me questions in return about the Krillian homeworld, about the way our seasons moved, about the songs sung by soldiers before they marched to battle. I told him once about a song my grandmother used to sing, one meant to calm young warriors before their first fight, a melody built around the idea that fear was not weakness, only the body preparing itself properly. He listened with such quiet attention that I found myself, against every instinct my mother had trained into me, wanting to keep talking, wanting him to keep listening. It frightened me more than the redacted file did, if I am honest. A weapon I could study and understand. A man who made me want to lower my guard was something else entirely. there were small moments that chipped away at the wall I had built around myself. One evening, a storm of debris struck the outer shielding of the outpost. Nothing dangerous, simply the ordinary hazard of space, but the sudden shudder through the walls startled me badly enough that my claws extended on instinct, ready to defend against a threat that did not exist. Ethan did not flinch away from me the way I expected a human might. He simply reached out, slowly, the way he always moved around me, and rested his hand near mine, not touching, simply present, until my claws retracted on their own. "You do not have to be ready for a fight every moment of every day," he told me quietly. "Not here, not with me." I remember laughing at him, a short, humorless sound, and telling him that a Krillian who lowers her guard does not live long enough to regret it. He only nodded, as though he understood the shape of that fear far better than I expected a human to. It was the following week that I first noticed him hesitate over food. We were sharing a simple evening meal, and one of the other officers, a broad, easygoing man named Dean Whitfield, mentioned in passing that a supply shipment had been delayed because of increased patrols near a distant system, a system I did not recognize by name. Ethan's hand paused over his cup for the briefest moment, so brief I nearly missed it, and then continued as though nothing had happened. I asked him later, once we were alone, if something about that system troubled him. He told me it was nothing, only an old assignment, nothing worth discussing. I let it rest again, though I noted the moment carefully, the way our scholars note the smallest tremor before a larger quake. I decided, finally, that studying him from a careful distance was no longer enough. If I wished to understand the shape of the danger sleeping quietly beside me every night, I needed to understand the humans around him as well, the ones who had actually served beside him, the ones who flinched in hallways and grew quiet whenever certain names were mentioned. I found my opportunity in a young communications officer named Lucy Grant, a woman perhaps a decade younger than Ethan, with sharp eyes and a habit of speaking honestly before she remembered she was supposed to be careful. I approached her one afternoon under the guise of learning more about human customs and steered the conversation gently toward her commanding officer. She grew quiet the moment I mentioned Ethan's name directly, glancing around the room as though checking for listeners before answering. "He does not like it talked about," she said finally, "but you are his wife now. You deserve to understand at least a little." She told me that Ethan had served during what humans called the Continental Conflict, a war fought not against another species, but among humans themselves, decades before they had ever encountered my people among the stars. She told me it had been the most difficult chapter of recent human history, fought over resources and old grievances that had festered for generations, a war so consuming that entire regions of their homeworld still bore the marks of it. She told me that near the end of that war, an engagement took place at a location she referred to only as Kepler 9, a coastal evacuation point where thousands of civilians were being moved away from an advancing force that had already broken through every other line of defense along that front. She told me that Ethan had been part of a rear guard assigned to hold that line long enough for the evacuation to complete, and that something had gone wrong, some failure of command far above his rank, and the rest of his unit had been withdrawn early, leaving him alone at a position that was never meant to be held by a single soldier. She said the official records claimed he held that line for nearly 2 full days. Alone, she said again, quietly, as if she still did not quite believe it herself, despite having read the reports many times over. 2 days, no reinforcements, no extraction, just him and whatever was left of the supplies he had, and the ships behind him slowly getting people to safety. I asked her what happened at the end of those 2 days. She told me she did not know exactly, that even she, with her clearance, had never seen the full record, only fragments, and that Ethan himself had never spoken of it to anyone still serving on this outpost, not once, not even during the routine evaluations that followed his return from that front. What she did know, she told me, was that when the evacuation ships finally confirmed they were clear, and reinforcements finally arrived at that coastal position, expecting to find a small unit still holding on, they found only Ethan, still standing, still in position, having never once left the line he had been assigned to hold. She said the number attached to that engagement, the one I had already seen buried in his redacted file, was the reason humans across the fleet spoke his name so carefully, and why soldiers who had never met him still stepped aside in hallways when he passed. Not because he demanded it. He never demanded anything, but because every soldier among them understood, in a way I was only beginning to understand myself, that they were in the presence of someone who had done something almost impossible to imagine surviving, and had done it not because he wanted glory, but because there had been no one else left to do it. I did not sleep well that night. I lay awake beside a man who cooked simple meals and asked gentle questions about my grandmother's songs, and I tried to reconcile that man with the story Lucy Grant had told me, and I found that I could not fully manage it. Not yet. The following morning, Ethan noticed the change in me immediately. He was perceptive in a quiet way that I had underestimated, and he asked gently if something troubled me. I told him, carefully, that I had learned a little about Kepler-9. His expression did not turn to anger, as I half expected. Instead, something in his shoulders seemed to fold slightly inward, a small collapse, as though a weight he carried every day had simply grown a little heavier in that moment. "I am not proud of that day," he said quietly. "People think it is a story about strength. It is not. It is a story about everyone else who did not make it home, and the fact that I did." I did not know how to answer him. I had been raised to believe that strength was something to display, something to be celebrated loudly, something you wore like armor in front of your enemies. Watching Ethan speak about the most extraordinary thing he had ever done as though it were a wound rather than a medal unsettled something deep inside the beliefs I had carried my entire life. I began, slowly, to understand that the number in his file was not a boast, it was a scar. Life on the outpost continued in its careful rhythm for another few weeks after that conversation. I found myself watching Ethan differently, not searching for weakness anymore, but searching, almost against my will, for the gentleness that seemed to exist so easily alongside whatever remarkable capability slept quietly within him. I found both, tangled together in ways I had never encountered in any Krillian warrior I had known. I began sharing more of myself with him as well, more than my instructions from the matriarch had ever required. I told him about the ritual ceremonies of my youth, about the long migrations our ancestors used to take before we built our first cities, about the particular ache of being a third daughter, always useful, never quite essential. He listened to all of it with the same quiet attention he gave to everything, and slowly, carefully, I stopped hating the fact that I had been given to him. It was during this fragile, uncertain peace, this quiet season of learning each other, that the messages began arriving from beyond the outpost. At first they were small things, encrypted signals intercepted by our communications array, fragments of chatter discussing dissatisfaction with the peace treaty among certain factions of my own people. I did not think much of it at first. Every peace has those who resent it. Every treaty has enemies on both sides who preferred the old, familiar shape of war to the uncertain shape of something new. But the messages grew more frequent, more specific, and eventually, more personal. References to the matriarch's third daughter, references to a location, references, unsettlingly, to timing. Ethan brought the intercepted communications to me himself, rather than keeping them hidden, a choice that told me more about him than almost anything else had until that point. He could have protected me by keeping me uninformed. Instead, he sat across from me, spread the reports carefully on the table between us, and told me plainly that a faction of my own people, angry at what they saw as a humiliating surrender, believed that ending the treaty by removing me would restart the war on terms they found more familiar. I remember feeling strangely calm as he told me this, calmer than I expected to feel, perhaps because some part of me had always known this peace was too fragile to remain untested for long, perhaps because Ethan's steady voice, laying out the danger without exaggeration or panic, made the threat feel smaller than it truly was. I asked him what he intended to do. He told me, simply, that he intended to keep me safe, and that I did not need to worry about the details. I did not yet understand how literally he meant those words. 3 days later, in the middle of what should have been an ordinary quiet evening, the alarms across the outpost began to scream, and I finally understood exactly what Lucy Grant had been trying, gently and incompletely, to prepare me for. The alarms were not the soft warning tones used for drills. These were sharper, faster, the kind of sound designed to move a body before the mind had finished understanding why. I was on my feet before I even realized I had stood, claws already extended, every instinct my mother had trained into me screaming that something was very wrong. Ethan was calm. That was the first thing I noticed, even through my own rising panic. He moved to the door of our quarters without hurry, checking a small device at his wrist, his expression settling into something I had not seen from him before, a stillness that had nothing soft or apologetic left in it at all. "Stay here," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Behind the inner bulkhead, not the outer one. Lock it once I am gone." I asked him what was happening, though some part of me had already guessed. "The faction we intercepted," he said. "They found a way through the outer perimeter faster than we expected. This is not a drill." I asked him where the rest of the outpost defense forces were, expecting him to gather soldiers, to call for support, to do all the things a commanding officer should do when danger arrived at the door. He told me they were already responding to other breach points, spread thin across a station never designed to defend so many entrances at once. He told me this particular breach, the one closest to our quarters, the one closest to me, was his. I did not understand what he meant by that word. His, not fully, not yet. I assumed he meant it was his responsibility to organize the defense. I did not yet understand that he meant something far more literal. He touched my shoulder briefly, the way he always touched me, careful and slow, and told me he would come back. Then he stepped through the door, into a corridor already filling with the sound of distant alarms and shouting, and he did not look back. I did as he asked for perhaps 3 minutes. I locked the inner bulkhead. I stood with my back against the cold metal wall, listening to my own heartbeat, trying to convince myself that staying hidden was the wise choice, the choice a soldier's daughter should make. I could not do it. Whatever fear I carried for myself was smaller than the fear I felt for him, walking alone toward danger with nothing but a sidearm and a calm expression, while every other officer on the outpost rushed toward the fight in groups, in armor, with backup close behind. I overrode the lock using access codes I still carried from my arrival, codes no one had thought to revoke from a diplomatic wife, and I followed the corridor he had taken, moving low and quiet the way my training had taught me, though my training had never prepared me for what I found at the end of that corridor. The breach point was a maintenance access near the outer ring of the outpost, a section rarely used, poorly lit, chosen clearly by whoever had planned this attack because it offered the fastest route toward the residential quarters where I lived. Several intruders had already forced their way through, Krillian soldiers wearing the dark, unmarked plating of the remnant faction that rejected the treaty, moving with the practiced coordination of soldiers who had trained together for exactly this kind of assault. Ethan stood alone at the mouth of the corridor between them and the rest of the station, and for one terrible moment, watching from the shadows of a side passage, I believed I was about to watch my husband die in front of me. I have seen Krillian soldiers fight. I grew up watching training exercises, watching real battles broadcast back from distant fronts, watching warriors twice the size of any human move with terrifying speed and strength. I expected to see Ethan overwhelmed within seconds. I braced myself for it, my claws already extending, some instinct in me preparing to rush forward and die beside him rather than watch alone from hiding. What I saw instead did not match anything I had ever witnessed before, in any battle, on any front, among any species. Ethan moved like something that had already solved the entire fight before it began. He did not charge forward with rage, the way a Krillian warrior might, drawing on anger as fuel for strength. He did not retreat cautiously, testing the enemy's capabilities before committing, the way careful human tacticians in old training records were taught to do. He simply moved, precisely, economically, as though every step and every motion had already been calculated far in advance, leaving nothing to chance and nothing wasted. The first intruder to reach him found his advance redirected with almost gentle efficiency, momentum turned back against its owner. The soldier disarmed and subdued before he had even fully understood that the engagement had begun. The second and third came together, coordinated, clearly trained to overwhelm a single opponent through numbers, and Ethan handled them the way a person might handle an unruly door that refused to close properly, with calm, focused pressure applied exactly where it was needed and nowhere else. I realized watching him that he was not trying to hurt them more than necessary. He was trying to end the confrontation as quickly and cleanly as possible, disabling each opponent with the least amount of force required to remove them from the fight. It was not the behavior of a monster reveling in violence. It was the behavior of someone who had done this so many times before that his body had learned to treat it as a problem to be solved rather than a rage to be released. More intruders poured through the breach, perhaps a dozen in total, and I watched Ethan meet each wave with the same unsettling calm, the same precise economy of motion, never raising his voice, never losing his footing, never once looking as though the outcome of this fight was in any doubt at all. At one point, a Krillian soldier larger than the others, clearly the leader of this particular assault group, charged directly at Ethan with the kind of overwhelming physical advantage that should have ended the confrontation immediately. I remember gripping the wall beside me hard enough to leave marks in the metal, certain that this was the moment everything would change. Ethan simply stepped to the side at the last possible instant, redirected the charge with a small, precise motion, and the larger soldier's own momentum carried him past and into the wall with enough force to end his part in the fight entirely. Ethan did not gloat. He did not pause to acknowledge what he had done. He simply turned toward the next threat, already moving, as though the encounter with the largest and most dangerous opponent in the group had been the least significant part of the entire engagement. Within minutes that felt to me like they stretched across an entire lifetime, the breach point was silent, except for the groans of disabled intruders and the distant sound of station security finally arriving to secure the area. Ethan stood at the center of it all, breathing steadily, his uniform barely disturbed, looking down at the aftermath with an expression that held no triumph in it whatsoever, only a quiet, exhausted sadness, the same expression I had seen the night he told me about Kepler 9. I stepped out from the shadows before I could stop myself, and he turned toward me immediately, his calm cracking for the first time that night into something closer to alarm. "I told you to stay behind the bulkhead," he said, and for the first time since I had known him, there was real emotion in his voice, something raw and frightened, though the fear was clearly not for himself. "I could not stay away," I told him honestly. "I could not simply wait to learn whether you were alive or not." He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, even amid the wreckage of the fight still settling around us. He reached out and gently checked that I was unharmed, his hands moving carefully over my shoulders and arms, checking for injuries with the same focused attention he had shown while disabling a dozen trained soldiers only moments before. "I am sorry you had to see that," he said quietly. I told him I was not sorry. I told him that what I had seen had changed something in me, though I did not yet have the words to explain exactly what. Security teams arrived in force shortly after, securing the disabled intruders, sealing the breach, sweeping the area for any remaining threats. Ethan gave calm, precise reports to the arriving officers, describing the engagement with the same understated modesty he brought to everything else, downplaying his own role, emphasizing instead the importance of securing the perimeter and treating the disabled intruders humanely. I stood beside him through all of it, watching the way the arriving soldiers looked at him, that same careful deference I had noticed on my very first day on the outpost, except now I finally understood exactly what that deference meant. It was not fear born from cruelty. It was the quiet, reverent caution people show toward something they know could end them instantly, but chooses, every single time, not to. Later that night, once the corridors had been cleared, and the immediate danger had passed, Ethan and I sat together in our quarters, in a silence that felt different from any silence we had shared before. I studied him carefully, the same soft-eyed, ordinary-looking man I had first seen on that data slate so many weeks before, and I tried to reconcile that image with what I had just witnessed. I asked him, finally, how he had learned to fight the way he did. I expected him to deflect, the way he always deflected questions about his past. Instead, he answered me honestly, perhaps because the events of that night had already stripped away his ability to hide behind polite evasions. He told me that after Kepler 9, after the 2 days he spent holding a line meant for an entire unit, something in him had changed permanently. He told me that the military had studied what happened to him extensively, trying to understand how one person had managed to do what he did, and that eventually they had asked him to help train others, to pass along whatever it was he had learned about calm, precision, and endurance under conditions that should have broken any ordinary soldier. He told me that he had spent years since then refining that understanding, not because he wanted to become more dangerous, but because he believed, deeply and quietly, that if he became skilled enough, precise enough, controlled enough, he might one day be able to end a fight before it truly began, sparing both sides the greater cost of a prolonged conflict. That is what tonight was, he said. Not a victory, a prevention. Every moment that fight lasted longer than it needed to was a moment where someone, on either side, could have been hurt more than necessary. I thought of my own people's traditions, the songs sung before battle, the belief that strength was meant to be displayed loudly, proven through overwhelming force and open confrontation. I thought about how differently Ethan approached the same fundamental problem, using his strength not to prove anything to anyone, but simply to end danger as quickly and gently as its nature allowed. I understood, finally and completely, why humanity had never demanded our surrender after that first devastating battle so many months ago. I understood why the peace offered to us had felt less like a diplomatic exchange between equals and more like a mercy extended by a species that could have simply taken whatever it wanted. Marrying Ethan Miles, I realized that night, had never truly been about binding our two peoples together through political tradition. It had been about placing me directly beside the very thing my people feared most, so that I, and through me, my entire family, might finally understand exactly how much restraint that thing had been showing us all along. I did not sleep again that night, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of everything I now understood. Beside me, exhausted from the fight and from years of carrying a burden he rarely spoke of, Ethan finally drifted into an uneasy rest, his hand still resting near mine, careful even in sleep not to reach too far, not to presume too much, the same quiet gentleness that had first confused me so many weeks before. I watched him sleep for a long time, studying the ordinary face that had once seemed so unremarkable to me, and I understood, with a certainty that settled deep into my chest, that whatever this marriage had begun as, it had become something else entirely, something I was no longer willing to walk away from, even if the treaty that bound us together were somehow undone. The remnant faction that attacked the outpost that night would not simply accept their failure quietly. I did not know it yet, lying awake in the darkness beside a man who had just single-handedly ended their assault without taking a single life unnecessarily. But their humiliation would only deepen their resolve, and somewhere among the stars, a much larger force was already beginning to gather, determined to succeed where this smaller attempt had failed so completely. In the days following the attack, I demanded answers that Ethan could no longer gently deflect. The wall he had built around Kepler 9 for so long had already begun to crack the night I found his redacted file, and after watching him move through a dozen trained soldiers as though solving a simple puzzle, I refused to accept careful half-explanations any longer. We sat together in our quarters one quiet evening, the station finally calm again after days of heightened security following the breach. I told him plainly that I needed to understand everything, not fragments, not careful summaries offered by a young communications officer trying to be kind, but the truth from him directly. He was quiet for a long time before he finally began to speak, and when he did, his voice carried none of the calm precision I had seen him use during the fight. It was tired instead, worn thin by years of carrying something too heavy to set down. He told me that the Continental Conflict had been the darkest chapter of human history in living memory, a war fought not against some outside threat, but among humanity itself, born from old grievances over resources and power that had been allowed to fester for generations until they finally erupted into something no one could control. He told me entire regions of his homeworld still bore the marks of that war, and that an entire generation of humans, his own generation, had grown up in the shadow of it. He told me that Kepler 9 had been a coastal evacuation point, one of the last still operating as an advancing force, broke through line after line of defense along that front. Thousands of civilians, families, children, elderly people who had nowhere else to go were being moved through that point toward transport ships waiting further out to sea. He told me that his unit had been assigned to hold the perimeter around that evacuation point long enough for the ships to load and depart safely, and that everything had gone according to plan for the first several hours. Then, he said, quietly, command above his own rank made a decision that changed everything. A larger, more strategically valuable position further down the coast came under sudden threat, and the officers overseeing the evacuation redirected almost the entire defending force to reinforce it, believing, incorrectly, that Kepler 9 could be abandoned safely once the last transport ship departed. They did not know, he said, his voice dropping lower, that the last transport ship would take nearly 2 more days to finish loading everyone who still needed evacuation. They did not know that thousands of people were still waiting on that coastline when the defending force was pulled away. I asked him what happened after that. He told me that when the order came through to withdraw, he refused. He told me it was not an act of heroism in his mind, not even in the moment. It was simply the only choice that made any sense to him. Thousands of people were still behind him, still waiting for ships that had not yet arrived, and if he left, there would be nothing standing between them and the advancing force at all. So he stayed. He told me the details sparingly, carefully, clearly still uncomfortable even now, so many years later, discussing what those 2 days had actually involved. He told me about exhaustion so complete that his body eventually stopped registering it as exhaustion at all, simply continuing to function because stopping was not an option he allowed himself to consider. He told me about learning, in real time, under conditions no training exercise could ever fully prepare a person for, exactly how much a human body and mind could endure when there was no alternative but endurance. He did not describe the specifics of what happened during those 2 days in detail, and I did not ask him to. Some things, I was beginning to understand, are not meant to be spoken of as stories. They are meant only to be carried, quietly, by the person who lived through them. What he did tell me was the ending, that when the final transport ship finally confirmed it was clear of the coastline, carrying with it every single civilian who had been waiting there, reinforcements arrived at the position, expecting to find nothing left standing. Instead, they found him, still holding the line he had refused to leave, having never once allowed the advancing force to move past his position toward the people he had been protecting. He told me that afterward, the military did not know quite what to do with him. They studied him, examined him, tried to understand what had allowed one person to accomplish something that should have required an entire battalion. Eventually, rather than simply celebrating him as a hero, the way I expected any culture would celebrate such an act, they asked him quietly, carefully, whether he would be willing to help them understand what had happened, so that no soldier would ever again be placed in a position where such sacrifice was necessary. He told me that was the true reason for everything that followed. Not glory, not celebration, a quiet, determined effort by an entire species to ensure that what happened to him would never need to happen to anyone else again. I asked him why he never spoke of it as something to be proud of. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice carried a rawness I had not heard from him before. Because pride implies I would want to do it again, he said. I do not. I would give anything for it to have never been necessary at all. The only thing I am willing to carry proudly is making certain it never has to happen to someone else. I thought, in that moment, about everything my own culture had taught me about strength. I had been raised believing that true strength was something to display, something proven through open confrontation, something celebrated loudly in songs and stories passed down through generations of warriors. Watching Ethan speak about the single greatest act of endurance I had ever heard of as something closer to a private grief than an achievement forced me to reconsider everything I had believed about what strength truly meant. I began to understand, slowly and completely, that Ethan's strength had never been the most important part of him. It was his restraint, his absolute refusal to use what he had become for anything beyond preventing harm to those who could not protect themselves. That restraint, I realized, was precisely what made him more unsettling to my own people than any display of overwhelming force could ever be. A weapon that only ever strikes when there is no other choice left is far more frightening than one that strikes eagerly, because there is no way to predict or provoke it into acting recklessly. I brought these thoughts to my mother during a private communication several days later, one of the few opportunities I had been given to speak with her directly since arriving on the outpost. I told her plainly, without the careful diplomatic language I had been trained to use, that I finally understood why this marriage had been arranged, and that I no longer believed it had ever truly been about binding two peoples together as equals. My mother did not deny it. She admitted, quietly, that the offer of marriage had never actually originated from our side at all, despite the story presented publicly to our people. It had come from Ethan's own government, offered gently, almost apologetically, as a way to prevent further conflict without requiring either side to feel as though they had surrendered anything. She told me that our council had accepted the offer not because they believed it represented true partnership, but because they understood, finally and completely, exactly what humanity was capable of, and they were desperate for any arrangement that might keep that capability pointed away from us permanently. I asked her plainly whether she regretted sending me. She was silent for a long moment before answering. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I do not regret choosing you specifically. You were always the daughter most capable of surviving whatever this arrangement required of you." I did not know, in that moment, whether to feel comforted or hollowed out by her answer. Perhaps both, in equal measure. That night, I found Ethan sitting alone at the narrow viewport in our quarters, exactly where I often found him in the quiet hours of early morning, watching the stars with that same permanent quiet vigilance I had noticed since our very first days together. I sat beside him without speaking at first, simply sharing the silence, before finally telling him what my mother had confirmed. He listened carefully, and when I finished, he turned to me with an expression I had not seen from him before, something closer to genuine surprise. "I did not think you would ever choose to see it that clearly," he said quietly. I told him that clarity had come slowly, built from many small moments, rather than any single revelation. I told him that whatever this marriage had begun as, whatever careful political calculations had brought us together, I no longer thought of myself as merely a diplomatic wife, fulfilling an obligation. I told him, plainly and honestly, that I had chosen him. Not the arrangement, not the treaty. Him, specifically, the quiet, apologetic man who cooked simple meals and listened carefully to old songs about fear and courage. The same man who carried an unimaginable weight so gently that most people around him never fully understood its size. He did not answer with words at first. He simply reached out, slowly, the way he always moved around me, and this time, instead of stopping just short of touching, he took my hand fully in his, and held it, and I let him. We sat together at that viewport for a long time that night, watching the stars in comfortable silence, both of us aware, though neither of us spoke it aloud, that the peace we had built together, fragile and new, was about to face a far greater test than the one it had already survived. The remnant faction that struck the outpost had been humiliated by their failure, and humiliation, among my own people, rarely fades quietly. Somewhere beyond the edges of our small, careful peace, A much larger force was already gathering, determined to succeed where a single small assault had failed so completely, and neither Ethan nor I yet knew exactly how close that final reckoning truly was. The warning came 9 days after that quiet night at the viewport, delivered not through intercepted whispers this time, but openly, almost proudly, as though the remnant faction wanted us to know exactly what was coming. A full battle fleet had assembled beyond the outer edge of the system, far larger than the small assault group that had failed to breach the outpost before. Sensors confirmed dozens of ships, thousands of soldiers, weapons platforms capable of threatening the entire station if given enough time to close the distance. The message that accompanied their approach was simple and direct. They demanded the treaty be dissolved. They demanded I be surrendered to them. And they made clear, without hesitation, that they intended to take by force whatever was not given willingly. The outpost fell into controlled chaos within minutes of the warning. Defense officers scrambled to organize a response, calculating whether the station's own defenses could withstand a fleet of that size, running projections that grew grimmer with every update. I watched the mood shift from careful confidence to quiet, barely suppressed alarm, as commanding officers realized just how outmatched the outpost truly was against a force gathered specifically to overwhelm it. Ethan remained calm through all of it, the same unsettling stillness I had witnessed the night of the first attack, though this time there was an added weight behind his eyes, a recognition that the stakes had grown considerably larger than a single breached corridor. He requested a private meeting with the outpost's senior command shortly after the warning arrived, and though I was not permitted inside as protocol required, he insisted afterward on explaining to me directly what had been decided, refusing to let me learn something so important secondhand. He told me that the full defense fleet stationed nearby had already been placed on alert, ready to respond in force if the remnant faction pressed their attack against the outpost itself. He told me, however, that he had requested something different be tried first, an alternative that had caused considerable debate among the officers present. He wanted to meet the approaching fleet alone, at the very edge of the system, before they ever reached the outpost at all. I told him plainly that this was not caution, this was recklessness, dressed carefully in calm language. A fleet of that size could not possibly be reasoned with by a single person, regardless of what I had already witnessed him accomplish against a dozen soldiers in a narrow corridor. He listened to my objection patiently before answering. He told me that if the full defense fleet engaged the remnant force directly, the resulting battle would likely destroy most of their ships and kill the majority of the soldiers aboard them, restarting exactly the kind of large-scale conflict between our peoples that both our governments had worked so hard to avoid. He told me that even a victory won that way would be a defeat in every sense that mattered, deepening resentment among my own people and undoing years of careful, fragile progress in a single violent afternoon. He believed, he told me quietly, that there was still a chance to end this without that outcome, not through force alone, but through the same precision and restraint that had defined everything he had done since Kepler 9. He believed that if the threat could be neutralized quickly enough, cleanly enough, before the full engagement between fleets ever began, the remnant faction's soldiers might survive to see the peace preserved even without their intended victory. I asked him plainly if he understood the size of what he was proposing to face. He told me he understood exactly, and that understanding it fully was precisely why he believed he was the only option that might prevent a much larger tragedy. I could not talk him out of it. I recognized, watching him prepare quietly in the hours that followed, the same calm determination I had seen the night of the first attack, and I understood that trying to stop him would accomplish nothing except denying myself the chance to stand beside him, even from a distance, while he faced what was coming. I insisted, and eventually convinced the command staff to allow me a place on the observation deck of the station's command center, where I could watch the confrontation unfold through long-range sensors and visual feeds, rather than being kept blind in some sealed section of the outpost. Ethan did not argue against this request, though I could see in his expression that he wished, quietly, that I would choose safety over presence. He never once told me I could not watch. He simply asked that whatever happened, I remember that he had done everything he could to prevent a greater loss. He departed the outpost in a small, single-pilot vessel, barely larger than the shuttles used for routine supply runs, a craft so unimposing that watching it launch toward a fleet of dozens of warships felt, to everyone gathered on that observation deck, like watching a single leaf drift toward an approaching storm. The remnant fleet slowed as his vessel approached, clearly expecting some larger force to be traveling behind him, some trick or ambush that would explain why a single ship would fly directly toward them without hesitation. When their scans confirmed he was entirely alone, their communications toward the outpost grew almost mocking, certain that this small gesture represented either surrender or foolishness. I watched the exchange unfold through the command center's monitors, my claws pressing so hard into the console edge that I nearly damaged the metal beneath them. Ethan's voice, calm and steady, carried across open channels as he addressed the remnant commanders directly, offering them one final chance to withdraw peacefully before anything irreversible occurred. They refused, exactly as I feared they would, their pride wounded too deeply by the failure of their previous assault to accept anything less than a decisive victory this time. What followed was unlike any battle I had studied throughout my entire life, and I had studied a great many, raised as I was among a culture that celebrated warfare as both art and tradition. Ethan's small vessel moved through the remnant formation with a precision that seemed almost impossible for a single craft to achieve against so many opponents at once. He did not attempt to overpower their numbers through direct confrontation. Instead, he exploited every gap in their coordination, every hesitation caused by their own confusion at facing something so unfamiliar, disabling weapons systems and propulsion sections of ship after ship with careful, targeted strikes that avoided, wherever possible, causing catastrophic damage to the vessels themselves. I realized, watching the pattern of his movements unfold across the tactical display, that he was doing exactly what he had done in that narrow corridor weeks before, applying only the precise amount of force necessary to remove each threat from the engagement, nothing more, sparing lives wherever the outcome allowed it. The remnant commanders, clearly unprepared for an opponent who fought with such calculated restraint rather than overwhelming aggression, began making increasingly desperate and uncoordinated attempts to overwhelm him through sheer numbers, and each attempt only seemed to create further openings for him to exploit. Ship after ship found itself disabled, drifting, propulsion and weapons systems rendered useless, crews left shaken but alive, while Ethan's small vessel continued moving through the remaining formation with the same unhurried, deliberate calm he brought to everything he did. Nearly an hour into the engagement, with more than half their fleet already disabled and drifting uselessly among the stars, the remnant commander finally broke communication silence, his voice carrying the unmistakable strain of someone confronting a reality he had never believed possible. He requested terms of surrender. I watched along with every officer gathered on that observation deck as the remnant commander addressed his surrender not to the outpost defense fleet, not to any governing authority, but directly and specifically to Ethan himself, a single individual piloting an unremarkable ship that had somehow dismantled an entire invasion force without a single confirmed loss of life on either side. Among my own people, surrendering to an individual rather than to a properly recognized authority carries almost no precedent, an act so far outside our traditions that several officers on the observation deck exchanged confused glances, uncertain how to even process what they were witnessing. Our entire culture of warfare was built around the idea that armies surrendered to armies, that authority answered to authority. Watching an entire remnant fleet yield not to overwhelming force, but to the quiet, controlled will of one single person, shattered something fundamental in how I understood conflict itself. Ethan accepted the surrender calmly, arranging for the disabled ships to be safely escorted rather than destroyed, insisting that the crews be treated fairly, and given the opportunity to return home rather than face harsh punishment for their part in the attack. He requested, specifically, that the matter be resolved through diplomatic channels rather than military tribunal, wherever possible, extending toward his defeated enemies exactly the same restraint and consideration he had shown toward everyone else throughout our entire time together. When his small vessel finally returned to the outpost several hours later, I did not wait for protocol or permission. I met him at the landing bay myself, and the moment he stepped down from that unremarkable little ship, exhausted but unharmed, I closed the distance between us and simply held him, uncaring of who among the gathered officers witnessed it. He held me back carefully, the same gentle way he always touched me, as though still afraid, even after everything, of being anything other than careful with me. "It is over," he said quietly, his voice tired but steady. "No one died today. That is what matters most." I thought, standing there in that landing bay, about everything that had brought me to this moment. A political marriage I had once viewed as little more than a survival strategy for my people. A soft-spoken man I had once dismissed as unremarkable. A redacted file that had first frightened me before it had ever helped me understand him. I thought about Kepler 9, about the weight he carried so quietly, about the restraint that had defined every single choice he made from the moment I met him. I had married a human for peace, believing, in my ignorance, that peace was something my people were being forced to accept from a conqueror we could not hope to resist. I understood now, standing in that landing bay with my arms still wrapped around him, that the truth had always been far different and far more remarkable than anything I had imagined on the day I first stepped off that transport ship. Humanity had not sent its armies to end our war. It had sent a single, quiet man, capable of ending entire conflicts through restraint rather than rage, so that armies, on either side, would never have to clash again at all. I watched him that evening, sitting once more at the narrow viewport in our quarters, looking out at the same stars he always watched, with that same permanent, quiet vigilance. And for the first time since I had known him, I understood exactly what that vigilance meant. It was not fear. It was responsibility, carried gently, carried quietly, by a man who had learned, through the hardest experience imaginable, exactly what it cost when someone was not there to carry it. I sat beside him, and this time I did not wait for him to reach for my hand. I reached for his first, and he turned to me with a small, tired smile, and together we watched the stars in silence, the fragile peace between our peoples finally beginning to feel, for the very first time, like something that might actually last.